Welcome back. Last time we discussed the debate over the created versus uncreated nature of the Quran. In this segment, we'll turn to the second major issue of adl, divine justice. A great debate that took place beginning early in Islamic history on the question of God's justice, and it was debated in Islamic civilization for centuries, was the following. One position was that we are capable of understanding through our intelligence what justice is, and that God cannot be unjust, God must be just. The other position said that whatever God does, that is justice. That is to say that we cannot understand what justice is, we can only accept what God says justice is. The concept of God's justice is a very, very important element in everyday religious life. How do we explain all of the apparent injustices of the world? All Muslims would agree that God is just. The Quran says that God is just. But how do we understand this justice? The Mu'tazilites believe that God cannot be unjust because he is God. If we do not see God to be just in a particular situation, it's because we don't see the whole curve of a person's life. We can't know everything from the time that a person leaves the divine reality, comes into this world, and goes back to God. The Mu'tazilite idea is that we are able to understand what justice is, and God being God is just. When God's motives in the unfolding of a situation are unclear or unknown to us, and so the act seems to be an injustice, we must remember that we are not seeing the situation in its very, very complex entirety. The Ash'ari took the opposite position. They emphasized above all else the idea of man's nothingness before God, and applied this concept to this issue. They said that we don't know what justice is independent of God. They believe that God is just in whatever he does, because all things come from him and belong to him. As one scholar put it, Ash'arism proclaims that the true, the beautiful, and the good are such because God wills it so without our being able to know why, and that the opposite could be the case if by chance God so willed. God doeth what he will, according to the Quran. But other Quranic formulations proclaim that God doeth what he is, which occurs, for example, when God carries out justice because he is the just, or when he produces beauty because, according to a hadith, he is beautiful, jamil, and loves beauty, or again, when he forgives because he is always by his very nature he who forgiveth, al-Ghafur. It is impossible for God to lie then, because lying is an imperfection. This being so, omnipotence does not imply that God might decide that lying is a perfection. God can do anything, but he cannot be contrary to his nature. He cannot not be God. Thus, for the Ash'arites, God's will supersedes the notions of truth and justice. In this, they overlook the very fundamental nature of God as just and would simply say, bila kayf, don't even ask questions. This position is much less open to the rational understanding of these very fundamental attributes of the divinity. Although the Quran has given us the basis for knowing that God is just in 100 different ways throughout its verses, and there are many ahadith on this subject as well, the way to an understanding of this is not given. That is why both schools of theology can take recourse to the Quran to support their positions. Each says to the other, you're wrong because of this particular verse. And so different schools arose, each claiming to go back to the Quran. But since the Mu'tazilites emphasized the possibility of understanding divine justice, they came to be known as the people of justice as well as unity, Ahl al-Tawheed wal-Adl, as we previously discussed. Finally, it's important to note that while many philosophers sided with the Ash'arites on many other theological issues, they sided with the Mu'tazilites on this particular issue. That concludes this segment on divine justice. Next time, we'll examine the implications of this for the question of free will versus predestination.